The gun carriage came around the last corner at a walk, and 800,000 people stopped breathing at the same moment. I know because I was among them, standing at the base of the cathedral steps in my dress reds, with my chin strap cutting into my jaw and my white gloves gripping my rifle so hard my knuckles had gone bloodless, and I heard the silence roll down the avenue toward us like a tide going out. No one had ordered that silence. Nobody had asked for it. It simply arrived, hat by hat coming off, head by head bowing, until the only sound left in the whole of Harrowgate was the iron wheels of the carriage turning over the cobblestones and the slow, even breathing of the 6 black horses that pulled her home. I had stood guard at that cathedral more times than I could count by then. I had stood through coronations and christenings, through the marriages of lesser royals and the funerals of old soldiers nobody remembered by name. I thought I understood what stillness cost a man. I did not understand it, not really, until I stood there that morning with my eyes fixed on a flag-draped coffin and made myself remain a statue while the woman inside it was carried past me for the last time. My name is Emeric Hale. For 31 years I served in the palace guard of Harrowgate, and for 20 of those years, the finest and hardest of them, I served in the household of Queen Isolde, wife of King Alaric, mother of Crown Prince Rowan. I was her guard from the winter I was 23 years old until the autumn I watched her coffin pass beneath the cathedral bell, and there has not been a single day since. And I am an old man now, with a grandson who calls me too slow to keep up with him in the garden, that I have not thought of her. People ask me sometimes, the young recruits who find out I served her, what she was like. They expect a story about crowns and diplomacy, about a queen gliding through palace halls in silk. I tell them instead about a woman who once threw a snowball at my head to see if I would flinch, who knew the names of every scullery maid's children, who sat on a hospital floor in a fever ward, everyone else in the kingdom was too frightened to enter, and who taught her only son to kneel down and look a beggar in the eye before she ever taught him how to wear a crown. That is the woman I am going to tell you about, not the woman in the newspapers. The woman I knew, from the first week of my posting to the last hour I stood over her. I need to take you back to the beginning, because you cannot understand what we lost at that funeral unless you understand what we had first. I arrived at the palace at Harrowgate in the depths of a hard winter, a young guardsman freshly commissioned out of the academy, terrified in the particular way that only a 23-year-old with a rifle and no experience can be terrified. I had grown up in a fishing village on the northern coast of Eldermoor, the son of a boat builder, and I had never in my life stood in a room with gilded ceilings until the day I reported for duty at the palace gates. My sergeant at the time, a barrel-chested man named Aldrich Vane, who had served 3 monarchs and buried 2, took one look at me shivering in the snow and told me that if I so much as blinked during the changing of the guard, he would have me mucking stables until I was 40. I did not blink. I had trained myself in the weeks before my posting to stand as though carved from stone. I could hold a position for 4 hours without so much as shifting my weight, without letting my eyes track a bird across the sky, without acknowledging the tourists who pressed their faces close to mine and made faces to try to break me. I was, if I am honest, rather proud of that discipline. It was the only thing I had that the palace-born officers around me did not. I should tell you a little about where that discipline came from, because it explains a great deal about why Queen Isolde's snowball landed on a young man so ready to receive it without flinching, and so unprepared for what would follow. My father built fishing boats for a living, hard, honest work that left his hands permanently scarred with rope burns and splinters, and he raised me and my younger sister alone after our mother died of a fever when I was 19, and my sister was barely 15. He was not a demonstrative man. He showed his love the way many men of that coast did, through steadiness rather than speech, through the quiet certainty that he would be standing at the same workbench every morning no matter what the previous night had cost him. I joined the palace guard largely because it offered a wage steady enough to help my sister through her physician's training, and because I possessed, even then, an unusual capacity for stillness that a recruiting officer passing through our village noticed and encouraged me to put to some formal use. The training itself was harder than anything I have done since, including, I would eventually learn, guarding a queen through the hardest year of her life. We were drilled for months in postures that felt, in the beginning, like a kind of slow torture, hours at rigid attention in freezing courtyards, senior instructors walking the line with lit matches held disturbingly close to bare skin to test whether a recruit's discipline would hold under real provocation, entire days spent learning to fire a rifle, march in perfect formation, and answer only in the fewest words protocol allowed. I was, by the end of that training, very good at being a wall. What I did not yet know, standing in the snow on my 9th day of actual duty, was that the woman I was about to meet had spent her entire life trying to teach the people around her that walls, however well built, were rarely the point. My father came to visit the palace only once in all my years of service, an occasion he treated with the same quiet, unshowy pride he brought to everything else in his life, and it happened, entirely by chance, on a day when Queen Isolde was walking the grounds. She noticed him at once, a weathered stranger standing awkwardly near the guard station, and rather than passing him by, she crossed the courtyard and introduced herself, and within a few minutes had drawn out of him the entire history of his boatyard, his late wife, and his daughter's medical training, exactly as she had once drawn the same details out of me. My father spoke of that conversation for years afterward, more animated about it than I had ever seen him about anything, and I understood, watching him tell it, that she had given my own father something I had never quite managed to give him myself. The simple, ordinary experience of being asked about his life by someone who genuinely wanted to know the answer. On my 9th day of duty, I was posted at the edge of the private garden behind the eastern wing, a quiet post reserved for junior guardsmen because almost nothing ever happened there. It was mid-morning, the ground still crusted with old snow, when the garden door opened, and a woman came out alone without an escort, wrapped in a plain gray coat with no crown, no jewels, nothing at all to mark her as anyone of consequence. I did not recognize her. I had only seen the queen at a distance, in state photographs and behind glass at ceremonies, always dressed as the occasion required. This woman looked, for all the world, like someone's aunt come out to clear her head. She walked the length of the garden path twice, humming something under her breath, and then she stopped directly in front of me and studied my face the way you might study a locked door you were trying to decide whether to knock on. "You're new," she said. I did not answer. I had been told, in no uncertain terms, that guardsmen on post did not speak unless spoken to by a superior officer, and I was not entirely sure a woman in a plain wool coat qualified. "You are new," she said again, more delighted this time as though she had solved a puzzle. "I can always tell. The old ones have learned not to hold their shoulders so square. It wears a groove in you after a while." She tilted her head. "What's your name?" Still I said nothing, staring straight ahead at a point on the garden wall, exactly the height specified in my training, though my heart was hammering so hard I was certain she could hear it. She laughed then, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and reached down and scooped a handful of the old crusted snow from beside the path. I saw it coming and did not move a muscle. The snowball caught me square on the shoulder and broke apart across my tunic, and I did not so much as blink. "Oh, that is very good," she said, clapping her gloved hands together like a delighted child. "Vane's boys are usually so easy to rattle. What is your name, soldier? I am asking you as your queen now, so you are obliged to answer." "Guardsman Emeric Hale, your majesty," I said, and my voice cracked slightly on the second syllable of my own name, which mortified me more than the snow soaking through my tunic. "Emeric Hale," she repeated, as though testing the weight of it. "I shall remember that. I remember everyone's name, you know. It is the one talent I have that nobody can take away from me." She looked at the melting snow on my shoulder with something like affection. "You'll do well here, Emeric Hale. Try not to let them starch all the kindness out of you, along with the collar." Then she turned and walked back inside, and I stood there for the rest of my 4-hour post with a wet patch spreading across my dress tunic, more shaken by 4 minutes of conversation than I had been by the entire brutal winter of training that preceded it. I told no one about the encounter. I assumed it had been a fluke, a passing amusement for a bored queen on a cold morning, and that she would never think of me again. I was wrong. 3 days later, the household office informed my sergeant that Queen Isolde had personally requested Guardsman Hale be assigned to her regular detail, and Sergeant Vane, who had never once in 11 years had a monarch request a guardsman by name, looked at me as though I had grown a second head. "What did you do?" he asked me, not really a question. "Nothing, sir." She threw a snowball at me. He stared at me a long moment, and then, for the first and only time in the 2 years I served under him, he laughed until he had to sit down. That was how it began. Not with ceremony, not with a formal introduction in some gilded hall, but with a snowball and a woman who had decided, on a whim, that the young guardsman who would not flinch was worth keeping close. I did not understand yet what an extraordinary thing that was, that a queen would take the trouble to learn the name of a 23-year-old guardsman, and then go out of her way to keep him near her. I would come to understand it over the following 2 decades, one small act of grace at a time, until it was simply the water I swam in, and I forgot to marvel at it, the way you forget to marvel at your own heartbeat. I want to tell you what kind of woman Isolde truly was before I tell you how she left us, because the ending only makes sense in the light of everything that came before it. She was, first and always, someone who refused to let the crown make her a stranger to ordinary people. She had married King Alaric young, before either of them fully understood what the throne of Eldermoor would ask of them, and in the early years of that marriage the court had tried, gently and then not so gently, to remake her into the kind of queen it expected: composed, distant, ornamental. She had smiled through those years and done exactly as she pleased, which turned out to be a far more radical thing than any public rebellion could have been. She insisted on knowing the household staff by name, not just the senior stewards, but the youngest kitchen maids, the boys who tended the stables, the women who did the laundry in the cold rooms beneath the east wing. She kept a small leather notebook, its cover worn soft from handling, in which she wrote down details about everyone she met: a sick mother, a daughter's wedding, a son gone off to sea. She would consult that notebook before she walked into a room and ask a scullery maid by name whether her mother's cough had improved, and the maid would nearly faint from the shock of being remembered at all. She did this for me too, in time. She learned that my mother had died when I was 19, that my father still built fishing boats on the northern coast, that I had a younger sister training to be a physician. She asked after them the way another person might ask after the weather, casually and constantly, until I stopped being surprised by it and started, instead, to feel something I can only describe as devotion. In those first months of standing at her side, I began to understand the shape of the life I had signed on to protect. She rose early, before the rest of the household stirred, and walked the same path along the long water at the edge of the palace grounds every morning, feeding the swans from a canvas sack of grain she kept by the garden door. She hated formal dinners and loved informal ones, the kind where the plates were passed hand to hand, and the conversation ran late into the evening. She had a laugh that could be heard through 2 closed doors, and a temper when it came that burned hot and fast and was gone within the hour, always followed by an apology delivered in person, even to the lowest servant in the household. And she had, even then, before I understood how deep it ran, a fierce and unshakable conviction that the crown existed to be useful to people who had nothing, not merely to decorate the lives of people who already had everything. I did not know yet where that conviction would take her, or what it would eventually cost her, or how it would come to define the rest of both our lives. I only knew, standing at her garden gate in that first winter, that I had been given the strange and unearned privilege of guarding something rare. I could not have told you then that I would spend the next decade watching her build a legacy out of small kindnesses, stacked one atop another, that I would watch her raise a son who would grow into a better man for having known her, or that I would one day stand at the foot of a cathedral and watch the whole of Eldermoor come to a stop to say goodbye to her. All I knew, in that first season, was that she had remembered my name, and that I intended to spend the rest of my career making certain she never had cause to regret it. The first true test of what she was made of came the following spring, and it taught me more about my new queen in a single afternoon than the entire preceding season had. There was, at that time, a fever moving through the poorest quarter of Harrowgate, a district the older guardsmen called the Hollow, because it sat in the low ground beneath the Palace Hill, where the drainage was bad and the tenements leaned against each other like exhausted men. The sickness was not the sort that killed quickly or dramatically. It settled into the lungs of the very old and the very young, and it lingered, and it frightened people badly enough that the physicians who treated it did so in gloves up to the elbow, and even then most of the court would not go near the district at all, not even to deliver blankets, for fear the illness clung to fabric and traveled home with them. Queen Isolde announced, over the strenuous objections of no fewer than 4 senior members of the household staff, that she intended to visit the fever wards herself. I was assigned to her personal escort that day, along with 2 other guardsmen and a royal physician who spent the entire carriage ride reciting, in an increasingly desperate tone, every reason this was inadvisable. She listened to him with the polite, unmoved patience of someone who has already made up her mind and is simply waiting for the other person to finish talking. The ward, when we reached it, was a long, low building with whitewashed walls gone gray with damp, rows of narrow beds pushed close together, and an air thick with the smell of carbolic soap failing to entirely cover something worse beneath it. The patients were mostly children, and the elderly, thin faces turning toward the door when it opened, too weak or too wary to show much surprise at who had walked through it. Queen Isolde walked the length of that ward, and before anyone could stop her, before the physician could finish saying her name in alarm, she stripped off her gloves, set them on the end of a bed frame, and took the hand of an old woman who had not been touched by anyone but a nurse in gloves for 11 days. "You must think we've all forgotten you," she said to the woman, and I watched the woman's face crumple, not from pain but from something closer to relief. She went bed to bed like that for 2 hours, bare hands the whole time, sitting on the edge of mattresses that had certainly not been designed to hold a queen's weight, asking names, writing them into the little leather notebook she carried everywhere, laughing at a boy's terrible joke about a physician's mustache, holding a dying grandfather's hand while his daughter wept quietly in the doorway. I stood at my post near the entrance the entire time, rifle at my side, watching a woman systematically dismantle every fear the kingdom held about that disease with nothing more than her own bare skin. When we left, the physician who had spent the carriage ride cataloging disasters was silent the whole way home. Queen Isolde looked out the window at the passing streets and said, mostly to herself, "If they see that I am not afraid to touch them, perhaps they will stop being afraid to help them." Within a month, volunteers were queuing at the fever ward gates. Within a year, the Crown had funded a proper sanatorium to replace the old damp building, and Queen Isolde visited it so often that the staff stopped announcing her arrivals and simply set a chair aside for her near whichever bed needed her most that week. She never once wore gloves there again, not in all the years I guarded her. I asked her once why, and she told me that a glove was a wall, and that the entire point of going at all was to knock the wall down. That was the first cause she gave her whole heart to, But it was not the last. In the years that followed, as her son grew from an infant into a boy, she took up a second devotion that mattered to her nearly as much. The children left behind by the old border wars, a generation of orphans scattered through the countryside, whose fathers had not come home from a conflict that had ended before most of them were born. She funded a home for them outside the city, visited twice a month without fail, and made certain, this detail always struck me, that every child there had at least one adult in the world who knew their birthday. I mention both of these causes now at the start of this account because everything else I am about to tell you about her, the mischief, the tenderness, the fierce love she bore her son, grew out of the same root. She simply could not walk past someone in need and pretend she had not seen them. It was, in its way, the least regal habit a queen could possibly have, and it was the thing that made the people of Eldermoor love her more than any crown ever could have. Prince Rowan was born in my second year on her personal detail, in the depths of a late autumn storm that rattled the palace windows so hard the older staff swore the whole east wing shook. I stood guard outside the birthing chambers through the night alongside two other men, and when the physician finally emerged near dawn to tell King Alaric he had a son, I heard the king's voice actually break. This stern and careful man who I had never once seen show more emotion than a raised eyebrow, as he thanked God and then went in to see his wife and child. I did not meet the young prince properly for some weeks, not until Queen Isolde began, against every instinct of the household nursery staff, insisting on taking him outside herself rather than leaving that duty entirely to nursemaids. She liked to walk him along the long water in the mornings, the same path she had always walked to feed the swans, now with an infant bundled against the cold in her arms, and I would fall into step a respectful distance behind her, watching the strangest and most tender sight of my young career. A Queen of Eldermoor murmuring nonsense songs to a baby while swans glided past expecting bread. There is one particular night from that first winter of the young prince's life that I have never told anyone outside the household, and I am only telling it now because I believe she would want it told, now that both of them, mother and the story itself, belong to history rather than gossip. It had snowed heavily for 3 days, the kind of snow that Eldermoor sees perhaps once in a decade, deep enough to swallow a boot to the ankle and silence the whole city under it. Prince Rowan was not yet 4 months old. It was well past midnight when Queen Isolde appeared at the nursery door in her nightgown, and a fur-lined coat thrown over it, the infant prince wrapped against her chest, and informed the startled night nurse that she was taking her son to see the snow. I was on duty in the corridor. She looked at me with an expression I would come to know very well over the following decade, a mixture of mischief and absolute certainty that I was not going to stop her, and said, "Emeric, you're coming with me and you are not going to tell a single soul, and if the king asks, you were escorting me on official business." "What official business, your majesty?" "The business of making sure my son sees snow before he is too old to be delighted by it, instead of merely cold." We went out through the garden door, the same one she had first walked through the day she threw a snowball at me, and she stood in the middle of that white silent garden at 1 in the morning, turning slowly so the sleeping infant in her arms could feel the snow drift onto his face, laughing softly when he startled and then, astonishingly, laughed himself, a small delighted infant laugh that echoed strangely in the muffled hush of the snow-covered garden. I stood a few paces back, my breath fogging in the cold, half convinced I would be dismissed from service by morning for allowing this, and entirely certain I would never forget it as long as I lived. "Every child should know what wonder feels like before anyone teaches him to be afraid of the world," she told me, when we finally went back inside, her cheeks bright red from the cold and her eyes bright with something that was not entirely about the snow. "I intend for my son to feel that his whole life, Emeric, even after he's a king. Especially after he's a king." I did not fully understand in that moment that I was watching the seed of the man Prince Rowan would eventually become. A man who, decades later, would still stop in the middle of state functions to crouch down and speak to frightened children at their own eye level. A habit every courtier who worked with him assumed was simply good instinct, and which I alone knew had been planted deliberately, one snowy midnight, by a mother who refused to let the crown steal her son's capacity for wonder. She was, I should say plainly, not a soft or foolish woman. She could be formidable when the occasion called for it, and there was steel under the warmth that few people outside the household ever saw. But her particular genius, the thing that made her unlike any royal I served before or since, was her refusal to believe that dignity and tenderness were opposites. She held both at once, effortlessly, the way some people can hold a tune in two keys simultaneously, and it confused the more rigid members of the court for years, because they could never predict which version of her they would get: the queen who could silence a room with a single level sentence, or the queen who would sit on a hospital floor holding a stranger's hand. I saw both sides of her most vividly in an incident involving a young kitchen maid named Prue in my 4th year of service, and I think of it often because it shows exactly how she used the authority of her position, quietly, cleverly, and always in defense of someone smaller than herself. Prue was perhaps 16, newly hired into the palace kitchens, and she had the terrible misfortune of dropping an entire silver tea service down a flight of servants' stairs directly in the path of Lord Chamberlain Aldous Fenn, the household's chief officer of protocol, a man whose devotion to correct procedure was matched only by his complete absence of humor about it. Lord Fenn, mortified and furious in the particular way that small men in positions of minor authority often are, informed the head housekeeper that the girl was to be dismissed by the end of the week, tea service or no tea service, for the crime of embarrassing him in front of a visiting dignitary who had happened to be passing at that exact moment. Word of this reached Queen Isolde, as most things eventually did, through the household grapevine, and she summoned me. I happened to be on duty outside her private sitting room that afternoon, with the particular gleam in her eye that I had learned meant a scheme was underway. "Emeric," she said, "I need you to go and find out everything you can about a kitchen maid named Prue, quietly, without letting Lord Fenn know I am asking." I did as instructed and learned that Prue's mother had died the previous year, that she was the sole support of 2 younger brothers, and that she had been so nervous carrying that tea service specifically, because she had heard Lord Fenn's reputation and been terrified of disappointing him. Queen Isolde listened to this report, nodded once, and then did something I have never seen a member of the royal family do before or since. She went personally to Lord Fenn's office and informed him with a perfectly straight face and not a hint of the mischief I could see dancing behind her eyes, that the tea service in question had, in fact, been dropped at her own instruction. As part of a private test she had been conducting of the household's emergency response procedures, and that young Prue had performed admirably under the circumstances and was to be commended, not dismissed. Lord Fenn, who would no more have questioned the Queen's word than he would have questioned the existence of gravity, apologized profusely for his overreaction, personally informed the head housekeeper that Prue was to remain in her position, and this was the detail that made the whole household laugh about it for months afterward. Once it was safe to laugh, insisted on a new set of emergency response drills being instituted in the kitchen staff's training. Entirely on the strength of a fabrication Queen Isolde had invented on the spot to save a frightened 16-year-old's livelihood. "You lied to Lord Chamberlain," I said to her afterward, more admiration in my voice than reproach, though I tried to keep my expression properly composed. "I redirected a truth that was about to do a cruel and unnecessary thing," she said. "Prue will be more careful on stairs from now on because she is grateful, not because she is afraid. That is a better outcome for everyone, including the tea service." She paused, and the mischief in her eyes deepened. Besides, Lord Fenn has needed a hobby for years. Emergency drills should keep him agreeably occupied for months. Prue went on to work in that kitchen for another 6 years before marrying a baker's apprentice and moving to a house near the Eastern Market. And every winter after that, for as long as Queen Isolde lived, a basket of the finest bread in Harrowgate arrived at the palace kitchens addressed simply to Her Majesty, with gratitude. And Queen Isolde ate a slice of it every single time, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who knew exactly what she had bought with one small, well-placed lie. There was another man from those early years I think of just as often, though his story unfolded more slowly than Prue's, over the better part of a decade rather than a single afternoon. His name was Corporal Osgood Miles, a veteran of the old border wars who had lost the use of his left leg to a shattered kneecap, and had spent the years since sweeping the flagstones of the outer courtyard for a modest pension, a job the household office had quietly created for him more out of guilt than gratitude. He was a proud man, sharp-tongued when he chose to be, and largely invisible to the courtiers who stepped around him on their way to more important business. Queen Isolde noticed him within her first month of walking the grounds, the way she noticed everyone, and made a habit of stopping to speak with him each morning on her way to feed the swans. She learned that he had served with distinction, that he had never married because he could not bear, in his words, to ask a woman to nurse a broken old soldier for the rest of her days, and that he still kept, folded in his coat pocket, a citation for bravery that no one in 20 years had thought to frame or display. On the anniversary of the battle in which he had been wounded, Queen Isolde arranged, without any announcement to the household press office, a small private ceremony in the courtyard where Corporal Miles swept each morning. She had the citation properly framed. She had King Alaric himself, persuaded with what I can only assume was considerable effort, presented in person, along with a formal commendation elevating the old corporal standing within the household guard, no longer a man who swept flagstones for a hidden pension but a yeoman of the grounds, a title with dignity attached to it and a wage to match. Corporal Miles wept openly at that ceremony, an old soldier who I am certain had not allowed himself to weep in front of another living soul in 20 years, and Queen Isolde stood beside him with her hand resting lightly on his shoulder until he had composed himself enough to speak. "You were not invisible," she told him, quietly enough that I nearly missed it, standing at my post a few paces off. "You were only surrounded by people too busy to look properly. I am sorry it took so long for one of us to look." He served another 11 years as yeoman of the grounds before age finally forced his retirement, and he attended every public event Queen Isolde held afterward that his health allowed, standing at the very back of every crowd in his old dress uniform, applauding louder than anyone else present. I do not believe there was a single soul in that courtyard the day of his ceremony, myself included, who did not understand exactly what kind of queen we had been given, and exactly how much of that quality would never appear in any official portrait of her. I could fill an entire account with stories like that one, small rescues, quiet interventions, kindnesses dispensed with the same careless confidence other people use to spend loose change. But I want to tell you about one more moment from those early years before I move forward in time, because it is the story that taught me she did not reserve her grace only for strangers and servants. She extended it, just as fully, to the people who protected her. My daughter Wren was born in my 6th year of service, and when she was 11 months old she fell seriously ill with a lung fever that the palace physician who examined her, off duty, as a personal favor, would not commit to a prognosis about. My wife and I sat up 3 consecutive nights in our small house near the palace walls, taking turns holding our daughter upright because it eased her breathing, both of us too frightened to say aloud what we feared. On the 4th morning, exhausted and unable to see straight from lack of sleep, I reported for duty anyway, because it did not occur to me that I had any right to ask for leave over a domestic matter while the household had need of its guardsmen. Queen Isolde took one look at my face when I arrived at my post and asked, without preamble, what was wrong. I told her. I do not know why I told her, except that something in her manner made it impossible to lie. She was gone within the hour, in a plain coat with no announcement to the household, to my own small house near the palace walls, where she sat with my wife and held my daughter while the royal physician, the actual royal physician, not the off-duty favor I had managed to arrange, examined her properly and prescribed a treatment that, within 3 days, broke the fever entirely. She visited twice more that week to check on Wren's recovery, sitting in our modest front room drinking tea from our chipped everyday cups without a single word of complaint about the accommodations. And by the time my daughter was fully well, Queen Isolde had somehow become, in my wife's words, the strangest and dearest family friend we have ever had, and also the Queen of Eldermoor, which we keep forgetting in the middle of conversations. I never asked her to do any of that. I would not have dared. But she did it anyway, the same way she had gone to the fever wards and rescued a frightened kitchen maid, and carried her infant son out into the snow at midnight, because it did not occur to her that there was any other way to be a person of consequence in the world except to use that consequence in service of the people around her. That was the woman I guarded for 20 years. I want you to hold on to her exactly as I have described her, warm, mischievous, fiercely protective of anyone smaller or more vulnerable than herself. Because the years that followed were going to test every one of those qualities against forces far larger and far crueler than a dropped tea service or a fever in an infant's chest. The trouble began, as trouble in royal households so often does, not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow accumulation of small complaints that eventually reached a volume no one could ignore. By the time Prince Rowan was 7 years old, Queen Isolde's habits, the fever wards, the orphanage visits, the refusal to be photographed only in staged, formal settings, had made her, without question, the single most beloved member of the royal family among the ordinary people of Eldermoor. That popularity, which should have been an unambiguous asset to the crown, instead became a source of quiet friction within the palace itself, because popularity of that particular kind, earned rather than inherited, unsettles people who have spent their careers believing that royal esteem flows only downward from the throne, never upward from the street. Lord Chamberlain Fenn, still smarting faintly from the tea service incident though he would never have admitted it, began circulating memoranda. I saw several of them myself, left carelessly on desks I passed while on duty, expressing concern about the informality of certain royal engagements and the risks inherent in unstructured public contact. A cluster of senior counselors, men who had built their careers on the old rigid model of monarchy, began murmuring to King Alaric that his wife's popularity was becoming, in their words, difficult to manage, as though love for a queen were a fire that needed containing rather than a gift that needed tending. I watched this pressure build over the better part of 2 years, mostly from the vantage point of a man standing silently at doorways, while important conversations happened just out of easy earshot, close enough to catch fragments, careful never to let my face show that I had heard anything at all. The pressure found its sharpest edge, for me personally, at a state banquet held that same spring for a visiting delegation from a neighboring kingdom, an occasion I remember with unusual clarity, because it was the closest I ever came, in 20 years of service, to breaking my composure on Queen Isolde's behalf rather than my own. A senior member of the visiting delegation, a minister whose name I have deliberately allowed myself to forget, found himself seated near enough to Queen Isolde during the reception to make conversation, and made the mistake of assuming that her reputation for warmth meant she would welcome being condescended to. He remarked, within my hearing and clearly intending to be overheard by the wider table, that he found it curious how the newspapers of Eldermoor seemed to print more photographs of their queen sitting on hospital floors than performing what he called the actual business of monarchy, and wondered aloud, with a thin smile, whether Her Majesty enjoyed playing nurse for the cameras. I stood at my post along the wall behind her chair, and I felt my hand tighten involuntarily around my rifle in a way that no training I had ever received sanctioned. It was not my place to react to an insult delivered to my queen at a diplomatic dinner, and I did not react, but I confess it cost me something to hold that stillness, and I have never entirely forgiven myself for how close I came to failing at it. Queen Isolde did not need my anger. She set down her glass, looked the minister directly in the eye with an expression of perfect, unhurried composure, and answered him in a voice pitched exactly loud enough for the entire table to hear. "I have held the hands of 40 people in this kingdom while they died, sir, and I have never once done it for a camera, because most of those rooms had none. I do the business of monarchy in the mornings, and I do the business of being a decent human being in the afternoons, and I have found, in my experience, that the second kind of business tends to outlast the first by rather a lot. Perhaps your own newspapers might try printing more of it. I find kingdoms that photograph kindness tend to produce rather more of it." The table went very quiet, and then the king's sister, seated further down, began to laugh, and within a moment the whole table had followed her lead, and the minister was left holding an empty glass and a considerably reduced opinion of his own wit. Queen Isolde returned to her meal as though nothing at all had happened, and it was only later that night, walking her back to her apartments, that I saw how much the exchange had actually cost her. A fine, fast tremor in her hands that she pressed flat against her skirts until it passed. "They will use that against me," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "Not the minister, Fen and the others. They will say I embarrassed a foreign dignitary at a state dinner, and they will not mention what he said to provoke it, because it is always so much easier to punish the woman who answered back than the man who insulted her first." She was not wrong. The incident was cited, indirectly but unmistakably, in the memoranda that began circulating in the weeks that followed, and it fed directly into the formal council session I am about to describe to you, though by then I had already come to understand something important about her, that her composure under provocation was not the absence of anger, the way mine was trained to be, but something harder and rarer. Anger transformed, in the space of a single breath, into something that could win a room instead of losing it. The matter came to a head at a council session I was posted outside of, in the spring of Prince Rowan's 9th year, when Lord Fen and 3 senior councillors formally requested that King Alaric restrict Queen Isolde's public engagements to a shorter, more tightly scripted calendar. Citing, I remember the phrase precisely, because it struck me as such a strange thing to say about a woman who had spent a decade holding the hands of the dying, concerns about the dignity of the crown. I was posted directly outside the council chamber doors that afternoon, close enough that fragments of the exchange reached me despite the thick oak between us. I heard Lord Fen's voice, careful and measured in the way of a man who has rehearsed his argument, describing what he called the erosion of appropriate distance between the crown and the governed. I heard another councillor, a stern old man named Baron Ellery Cray, who had served 3 monarchs before Alaric and trusted almost nothing that had not existed in his own youth, remarked that a queen who could be found weeping over the bedside of a dying commoner one week and hosting a foreign minister the next risked, in his words, confusing the public about which version of her they were meant to revere. I heard King Alaric's voice too, quieter than the others, asking questions rather than making arguments. The sound of a man testing the weight of something before deciding whether he had the strength to lift it. I did not hear the king's initial response, but I heard, later that evening, through the household grapevine that moves faster than any official channel, that he had not immediately refused them. He had asked for time to consider it. And I understood, standing at my post that night outside the royal apartments, that the king I had watched weep with joy at his son's birth was now weighing, in some private calculation I was not privileged to witness, whether his wife's compassion had become a political liability. Queen Isolde learned of the council's request within a day. Nothing of consequence stayed secret in that palace for long, and I have never before or since seen her as quietly furious as she was that week. Not loud. She was never loud when she was truly angry. The volume of her voice actually dropped, which anyone who knew her learned to fear far more than shouting. They want me to visit fewer sick children so that fewer newspapers print photographs of me being useful, she said to me one evening, as I escorted her back from a private audience with the king that had clearly not gone entirely her way. Do you know what frightens men like Fen, Emeric? It is not that I embarrass the crown. It is that I have shown, for 10 years, that a queen does not need to be distant to be respected. That is a dangerous example to set, because it means every queen after me will be measured against it. I did not answer, because it was not my place to, but I remember thinking that she had understood something about her own situation with terrible clarity, and that I had no idea how it would resolve. It resolved in the end, not through a council vote or a formal decree, but through King Alaric himself, in a manner that I witnessed firsthand and have never forgotten. The crown had scheduled, some months prior, a formal ceremony to open the new wing of the fever sanatorium that Queen Isolde's original visit years before had ultimately caused to be built. A gleaming building now, brick and clean glass, replacing the damp whitewashed ward where she had first taken off her gloves. It was meant to be a modest half-hour event, a ribbon and a plaque and a few photographs, the king attending mostly as a courtesy alongside his wife. I do not know what changed in him in the weeks leading up to that ceremony. Perhaps it was watching his son practice, without prompting, the habit of learning servants' names, a habit the boy had clearly absorbed from his mother the way a plant absorbs light. Perhaps it was simply that a king, given enough quiet time to think, eventually remembers what actually matters to him. Whatever the reason, King Alaric arrived at that ceremony not for half an hour, but for the entire afternoon. He toured every ward. He sat, awkwardly at first and then with visibly growing ease, at the bedside of an elderly patient and asked about her grandchildren. And at the closing of the ceremony, in front of the assembled press and a crowd of ordinary Harrowgate citizens who had come to see the new building, King Alaric departed entirely from his prepared remarks. I watched Lord Fenn's face go pale as the king set the card down on the podium unread, and spoke, plainly and without notes, about his wife. There have been those, he said, who have suggested to me that Her Majesty's manner of serving this kingdom is somehow beneath the dignity of the crown. I want to say, in front of all of you, that I have watched my wife hold the hands of the dying in wards no one else would enter. I have watched her remember the names of servants that half this court could not name if their lives depended on it. If that is not dignity, then I confess I no longer know what the word means, and I will hear no further argument on the matter from any quarter. There was a silence after he finished, and then the crowd of ordinary citizens who had gathered outside the new sanatorium began to applaud, and it did not stop for what felt like a very long time. I stood at my post near the entrance, watching Queen Isolde's face as her husband defended her in public for the first time in years, and I saw her blink hard, several times, in the particular way people do when they are refusing, on principle, to let themselves cry in front of a crowd. Lord Fenn never raised the matter of restricting her engagements again. The council's quiet campaign dissolved within weeks, and for the better part of the next 6 years, Queen Isolde's public life resumed its full and unrestricted course, more beloved than ever, the king now visibly, publicly at her side in a way he had not always managed to be before. It felt, at the time, like a complete victory, the kind of ending a story is supposed to have. I want to be honest and tell you that I believed, in that season, that the hardest chapter of her life was behind her, and that everything from that point forward would simply continue to be as good as it had been. I was wrong, though it would be years before I understood how wrong, and the years between that ceremony and the beginning of the real trouble were, I am grateful to say, some of the richest of my entire career. The kingdom marked King Alaric's 15th year on the throne with a jubilee some 2 years after the sanatorium ceremony, a grand and formal occasion that the household office spent the better part of a year preparing, and it was during the planning for that jubilee that I saw, perhaps more clearly than at any other point in my service, exactly how far Queen Isolde had managed to shift the character of the entire royal household, without ever holding a single title that gave her the formal authority to do so. The original plan, drafted by the same faction of the council that had once tried to curtail her public engagements, called for the customary grand procession through the wealthiest districts of Harrowgate, ending in a formal banquet attended exclusively by nobility and foreign dignitaries. Queen Isolde reviewed the plan, said nothing critical of it directly, and instead quietly proposed an addition rather than an objection. A second procession, to be held the following morning, through the hollow and the outer districts where the sanatorium and the orphanage stood, ending not in a banquet but in a public festival open to any citizen of the kingdom who wished to attend, with food, music, and games arranged for families who could never have afforded a place at the formal proceedings the night before. The council grumbled about the expense and the logistics, but by then Queen Isolde's judgment on matters of public sentiment had been proven correct often enough that no one seriously fought her on it, and the second procession went forward largely as she had designed it. I have never, before or since, seen a happier crowd than the one that filled the Hollow's central square that morning. Musicians played on makeshift stages built from cart platforms. Children who had never in their lives attended a royal event ran freely between food stalls donated by merchants Queen Isolde had personally persuaded to contribute. King Alaric, walking beside his wife through streets he had rarely visited before her influence on him took hold, stopped so many times to speak with ordinary citizens that the formal schedule collapsed entirely within the first hour, and no one, least of all the king himself, seemed to mind in the slightest. Prince Rowan, 16 that year and newly commissioned as a cadet, spent the entire festival working alongside the household kitchen staff, serving food to a line of citizens that stretched the length of the square, refusing every suggestion that he take a more ceremonial role, laughing and trading jokes with people who had no idea, for much of the afternoon, that the young man ladling stew into their bowls was heir to the throne of Eldermoor. I stood at the edge of that square for the better part of 6 hours, watching a kingdom celebrate itself rather than merely its monarchy, and I remember thinking, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes to a man standing very still for a very long time, that I was watching the truest legacy Queen Isolde would ever leave behind. Not a policy, not a building, not even the sanatorium or the orphanage themselves, but a simple, radical idea that had somehow taken root in the highest levels of a kingdom that had never before considered it. That the measure of a good reign was how well it served the people who would never sit at its table, unless someone with power made a point of inviting them. The Jubilee Festival in the Hollow became, in the years that followed, an annual tradition in its own right, one that continues even now, long after Queen Isolde's death, and I have watched Crown Prince Rowan preside over it himself in recent years with the same easy, unforced warmth his mother modeled for him that afternoon, still ladling stew when the occasion calls for it, still more comfortable in that square than in any formal banquet hall the palace has to offer. Prince Rowan grew in those years from a solemn, watchful boy into a young man who carried his mother's instincts inside a frame that was increasingly his father's. Tall, composed, careful with his words in the way his father had trained into him, but with a warmth underneath that his mother had planted so early it had simply become part of his bones. I remember one particular afternoon, when the prince was perhaps 12, that captures better than anything else I could tell you exactly what Queen Isolde was trying to build in her son. She had arranged, again without informing the household office, a habit that never entirely left her, to take Rowan into the city in plain clothes, disguised as thoroughly as a queen and a crown prince could manage in dull wool coats and unremarkable boots, with myself and one other trusted guardsman trailing at a discreet distance, dressed as ordinary men rather than in our uniforms, which felt so strange to me that I kept catching myself standing too straight and having to consciously slouch. She took him to the Hollow, the same poor quarter where the fever ward had once stood, now much improved but still home to families who had little. She gave her son a small purse of coins before they set out and told him, in front of me, that he was not to give the money away all at once, and that he was not to hand it over without first learning something about the person receiving it. I watched from 20 paces back 12-year-old Prince Rowan approach an old man selling roasted chestnuts from a cart on a cold street corner, awkward and unpracticed, clearly having no idea how to begin a conversation with a stranger who did not know he was a prince. His mother did not intervene. She stood back with me, watching her son fumble through an introduction, ask the old man's name, ask how long he had sold chestnuts on that corner, and I saw the exact moment the boy stopped performing a lesson and started actually listening to the answer, his shoulders relaxing, his questions becoming genuinely curious instead of dutiful. He gave the man 3 coins, far more than a bag of chestnuts was worth, and the old man, not recognizing the boy but touched by his manner, gave him a bag for free anyway and told him he had good manners for a young man his age, better than most. "He doesn't know who I am," Rowan said, rejoining his mother, sounding faintly amazed by this, as though it had genuinely not occurred to him that a stranger could be kind to him for no reason connected to his birth. "No," Queen Isolde agreed. "He was kind to you because you were kind to him first. Remember that feeling, Rowan. It is the truest thing anyone will ever teach you about power. It means nothing at all unless you use it to make someone else's day a little easier, and the people who matter most will never know your name." We spent 3 more hours in the Hollow that afternoon, the young prince giving away his coins one careful conversation at a time, learning the names of a seamstress, a boy his own age selling newspapers, a widow who kept a small stall of second-hand books. By the time we returned to the palace, disguises shed at the garden gate, Rowan was talking animatedly about every person he had met, and Queen Isolde caught my eye over his head with an expression of such pure, satisfied joy that I have thought of it many times since, in the years when I needed to remember that she had, in fact, gotten exactly what she wanted out of her life, however short it turned out to be. I do not think it is an accident, and I have said as much to anyone who has asked me over the years, that Crown Prince Rowan grew into a man who is known, even now, for stopping his carriage to speak with ordinary citizens, for remembering the names of guardsmen most royals would never notice, for treating his own household staff with a warmth that startles visitors from other courts. People assume it is simply his temperament. I know better. I watched his mother build that temperament into him, deliberately, one afternoon in the Hollow at a time, the same patient way a gardener trains a young tree to grow toward the light. There was one custom Queen Isolde established in her earliest years, as mother of the household, that endured for the whole of my service to her, and which I believe did more to shape the character of the palace at Harrowgate than any single policy or public engagement could have. Every year, on the night before the winter feast, when the royal family traditionally dined alone in a private hall reserved for that purpose, Queen Isolde instead insisted on a different arrangement entirely. A single long table set up in the grandest hall of the palace, at which every member of the household, from the king himself down to the youngest scullery maid and the newest guardsman on duty, sat together as equals and shared the same meal. The first year she proposed it, the household office informed her, with as much tact as they could manage, that such an arrangement had no precedent in the history of the crown, and that certain members of the nobility invited to the palace for the season might find it beneath their dignity to share a table with the staff who served them. Queen Isolde's response, relayed to me second-hand by a steward who had been present, was simply that any noble who found it beneath their dignity to sit beside a scullery maid was welcome to take their dinner elsewhere, and that the invitation would not be extended twice. Not a single noble declined. I suspect most of them were rather more curious than offended, and by the third year, the arrangement had become the most sought-after invitation in the kingdom's social calendar, precisely because it could not be bought or inherited, only offered by a queen who meant exactly what she said. I sat at that table myself for 18 consecutive years, on whichever nights I was not posted on active duty, and I can tell you that I never once, in all that time, saw King Alaric look more at ease than he did on those evenings, seated between his wife and whichever junior member of the kitchen staff happened to draw the seat beside him that year, listening with what appeared to be genuine and undivided attention to whatever they had to say about their families, their troubles, their small triumphs. Queen Isolde moved the seating assignments deliberately every year, by a method she never fully explained to anyone, though I came to suspect she simply matched people she believed needed to hear from each other. An old widowed duke seated beside a young stable hand who had recently lost his own father, a visiting foreign minister seated beside the head laundress, whose stories of raising 6 children alone on a servant's wage had, more than once, visibly moved hardened men who had arrived at that table, expecting nothing more than a formal state dinner. Prince Rowan grew up at that table. He learned, before he learned almost anything else about ruling a kingdom, that the measure of a good host was not the grandeur of the room, but the ease of the person seated at the lowest end of it, and I have watched him carry that exact instinct into his own household in the years since, insisting, even now, that his own staff dine with his family on the eve of the winter feast, a tradition his mother built with nothing more than a single stubborn refusal to dine alone. There were other moments in those years, dozens of them, hundreds if I am honest, that I could recount to you in the same detail. The year she personally organized a wedding for 2 of the palace's longest-serving staff members, insisting on paying for it herself out of her own private funds, so it would not draw scrutiny as an official expense. The winter she quietly arranged for every guardsman on the night watch, myself included, to receive a warm coat lined with sheared wool after she noticed, on one of her late walks, how badly the standard-issue uniforms performed against the cold. The summer she taught Rowan and a group of household children, my own daughter Wren among them by then, to swim in the long water, laughing so hard at her own poor technique that half the lesson dissolved into splashing chaos, while I stood guard at the water's edge trying, unsuccessfully, to keep my composure. One further moment from those years deserves to be told in full rather than folded into a list, because it shows better than anything else how carefully Queen Isolde had prepared her son for the life he would one day have to carry alone. When Prince Rowan turned 16, tradition required a formal ceremony in the great hall of the palace at Harrowgate, presenting him to the assembled nobility and the household guard as a cadet of the crown, the first formal step toward the military commission every heir to the throne of Eldermoor was expected to hold. It was, by design, a stiff and ceremonial occasion, heavy with old customs and older speeches, the kind of event Queen Isolde generally endured rather than enjoyed. She surprised the entire household that year by asking, weeks in advance, whether she might be permitted to speak before the formal proceedings began, a request so far outside ordinary protocol that Lord Fenn spent the better part of a week trying to determine whether it was even permissible under the ceremony's ancient charter. Permission was eventually granted, largely because no one could summon the nerve to refuse her, and so it was that Queen Isolde stood before the full assembled court, her son at attention before her in his new cadet's uniform, and spoke without notes for perhaps 3 minutes that I have never forgotten. "They are going to teach you a great many things in the years ahead," she told him, in a voice that carried easily to the back of the hall. "How to command men, how to read a battlefield, how to sit a horse in a parade line without flinching no matter what is thrown at you. All of it is worth learning, and I expect you to learn it well. But I want you to remember one thing above all the rest, and I want everyone in this hall to hear me say it, so that they may hold you to it in the years to come." She paused, and I watched the entire hall lean fractionally forward. A uniform is not a wall you put on to keep the world at a proper distance. It is a promise you put on to move closer to the people who need you. If you ever forget which one it is, come and find me, and I will remind you, crown or no crown, until my very last breath. There was a long silence when she finished, the particular silence of several hundred people simultaneously deciding not to be the first to break it. And then King Alaric himself began to applaud, and the whole hall followed, and I watched 16-year-old Prince Rowan stand at attention with tears standing openly in his eyes, making no attempt at all to hide them, because his mother had also taught him, long before that day, that there was no shame in a man's grief or his gladness showing plainly on his face. I thought of that speech many times in the years that followed, and I think of it still, because it turned out to be, in its way, the truest description she ever gave of her own life, delivered to her son as a lesson and lived by herself as a creed for every day she had left. I tell you all of this not to overwhelm you with anecdotes, but because I want you to understand the sheer accumulated weight of the years I am about to tell you were taken from her, and from all of us. It is one thing to say a woman died too young. It is another thing entirely to have watched, firsthand, exactly how much good she still had left to give, and to know precisely how much of it never got the chance to happen. The first sign of anything wrong came so quietly that I did not recognize it as a beginning until much later, when I was able to look back and assemble the small moments into a shape. Prince Rowan was 17, tall and serious, and already beginning the long formal education that would prepare him one day to take his father's throne, when I first noticed that Queen Isolde had begun, very occasionally, to take my arm during her morning walks along the long water. It was such a small thing. She had always been a vigorous walker, setting a pace that left junior guardsmen half out of breath trying to match her, and now some mornings she would simply reach out and rest her hand lightly on my forearm, as though it were an old habit rather than a new one, and we would walk more slowly, and she would talk about ordinary things, the swans, a letter from her sister, something amusing Rowan had said at breakfast, as though nothing at all had changed. I asked her once, carefully, whether she was quite well, and she waved the question away with the particular briskness she used when she did not want to discuss something further, and told me that a woman was entitled to walk slowly through her own garden without the entire palace convening an inquiry about it. I let the matter drop because it was not my place to press her, and because I told myself, as people so often do when they are afraid of an answer, that it was almost certainly nothing. It was, I would learn far later, not nothing. She had been unwell for some months by that point, quietly, privately, seeing physicians outside the palace under an assumed name to keep the matter from the household staff, and most of all from her son, whom she was determined not to worry until she had a clearer picture of what she was facing. I do not know, even now, the precise name the physicians gave to her illness, and I have never sought to learn it, because I do not believe it is my place, or anyone's, to reduce the woman I served for 20 years to the clinical name of the sickness that eventually took her. What I know is what I witnessed, and what I witnessed was a slow, dignified erosion of a strength I had always thought of as inexhaustible. A heart, the physicians eventually told King Alaric, that had simply begun to fail, quietly and steadily, the way a candle burns down evenly to its base without ever guttering or flaring. She continued her rounds at the fever sanatorium and the orphanage for nearly a year after I first noticed her taking my arm, growing thinner, growing more tired, but never once canceling an engagement, never once telling the children at either place that anything at all was wrong. I watched her on more than one occasion, summon an energy from some reserve I did not know she still had, walk into a ward or a courtyard bright-eyed and laughing, spend 2 full hours exactly as present and attentive as she had ever been. And then, the moment the carriage door closed behind us on the way home, sink back into the seat, close her eyes, and simply breathe, slowly and carefully, for the entire ride. As though she had spent every ounce of herself on the people inside those walls, and had nothing at all left over for herself. "Don't tell Rowan," she said to me once on one of those quiet carriage rides home, her eyes still closed, her voice thinner than I had ever heard it. "Not yet. He has examinations. He has his whole life ahead of him. Let him have this year unburdened, Emeric. I am asking you as a friend now, not as your queen." I kept that confidence for the better part of 8 months, watching a young man I had known since infancy grow increasingly puzzled, and then increasingly frightened by his mother's changing habits, the shortened walks, the earlier bedtimes, the way she had begun declining evening events she would once never have missed, without being able to give him the honesty he deserved, because I had given my word to a woman who had never once, in 20 years, asked anything of me that was not, in the end, for someone else's good. The illness could not stay hidden forever, of course. Illness of that kind rarely can. There came a morning, in what I now understand were the final months, when Queen Isolde simply did not appear for her walk along the long water, and King Alaric himself came to find me at my post, his face carrying an expression I had never seen on him before, not even during the darkest days of the council's campaign against her, and told me, in a voice stripped of all its usual formal composure, that his wife was unwell, and that the household should prepare itself. I remember standing very still when he told me, the same discipline that had once earned me a place at her side now serving, cruelly, to keep me upright while the ground seemed to tilt beneath my boots, and asking him, because it was the only question that mattered to me in that moment, whether Prince Rowan had been told. "I am telling him this morning," the king said. "I wanted you to hear it from me first, Hale, because I know what you have meant to her these 20 years. She would want you prepared before the rest of the household." I do not know, entirely, how I managed the rest of that day's duty. I know that I stood at my post with the same rigid stillness I had trained into myself as a young guardsman in the snow, and that behind that stillness, I felt something break quietly apart that has never, in all the years since, entirely mended. The final months were, in their own terrible way, some of the most tender of my entire service to her. Once the truth was out in the open, Queen Isolde stopped hiding her tiredness, stopped performing an energy she no longer had, and instead allowed herself, for the first time in the 20 years I had known her, to simply rest. She still insisted on her morning walks, though they grew shorter each week, my arm beneath her hand for the entire distance now rather than only occasionally. She still asked after every guardsman's family by name, still consulted her worn leather notebook, still laughed at Rowan's increasingly desperate attempts to make her smile. Prince Rowan, 18 now, spent every hour his studies allowed at her bedside, and I watched a boy become, almost overnight, the kind of man who could sit beside his dying mother and still find something to laugh about, because she had taught him, all those years ago in the hollow and in the snow-covered garden, that grief and tenderness were not opposites either, any more than dignity and warmth had ever been. She insisted, against the strong recommendation of her physicians, on one final visit to the orphanage beyond the city walls, some 6 weeks before the end, when she could still manage a short carriage ride if she rested for the whole of it beforehand. I drove with her that day, along with a nurse who sat quietly in the corner of the carriage with a bag of supplies she prayed she would not need to use, and I watched Queen Isolde spend the entire journey composing herself, breath by careful breath, so that the children waiting for her would see nothing but the woman they had always known. She did not tell them she was dying. She had decided in the days before that it was not a truth children needed to carry, and instead she simply visited as she always had, moving from room to room, sitting rather than standing this time, but asking the same questions she always asked, remembering the same details from her worn leather notebook, laughing at the same jokes children have always told visiting adults in the hope of being thought funny. Near the end of the visit, the house matron gathered the older children, the ones old enough to sense that something in the visit felt different this time, though none of them could have said what, and Queen Isolde spoke to them for a few minutes in a voice that carried none of the frailty I had watched grow in her over the preceding months. "I want you to remember something for me," she told them. "Whatever happens in your lives, whatever anyone tells you about where you came from or what you are owed by the world, you are not defined by what you lost. You are defined by what you choose to build with what remains. I have watched every one of you build something remarkable out of very little, and I am prouder of you than I have been of almost anything else I have done with my life. Carry that pride forward, even on days when I am not here to remind you of it." Several of the older children wept, though I do not believe any of them yet understood the full weight of what she was telling them. She held each child's hand before she left, bare palm against bare palm in the way that had defined her entire public life, and by the time we returned to the palace that evening, she was too exhausted to speak for the remainder of the night, having spent, quite deliberately, the last full measure of strength she had left on people who would need to carry her memory the longest. I learned, only after her death, that she had left a private endowment in her own name to fund that orphanage in perpetuity, structured so that no future government or council could ever quietly starve it of resources the way institutions serving the powerless so often are. It was, I have always believed, the last and most careful act of protection she performed for anyone, arranged in the same season she could no longer walk its halls herself, so that the children she could no longer visit in person would never once feel the absence of her care in any way that mattered to their daily lives. There was one afternoon, perhaps 3 weeks before the end, when she asked to see me alone, which she had never done in quite that formal a way before. I stood at the foot of her bed, my chin strap fastened, my posture as correct as it had been on my very first day of duty, and she looked at me for a long moment with an expression I can only describe as deeply, quietly satisfied, the way a person looks when they are taking stock of a life and finding, on balance, that it had been a good one. "You never once broke composure in 20 years, Emeric," she said, her voice faint but steady. "Not the day I threw a snowball at you, not the day I carried my son out into the snow and half convinced you that you would be dismissed for it, not once. Do you know what I valued more than that stillness, though?" I told her I did not. That underneath it, the whole time, you were never actually still at all. You cared about every single thing that happened in this household. I could see it in your eyes even when your face gave away nothing. That is the rarest kind of guard there is, and I want you to know that I saw it every single day and I am grateful for it. She reached out and took my hand, the same way she had taken the hand of that old woman in the fever ward all those years before, bare skin against bare skin, no glove between us. "Look after my son when I am gone, not as his guard. As the man who helped me raise him to be decent. He is going to need people around him who remember what I was trying to build in him. Once I am not here to remind him myself." I promised her that I would, and I have spent every year since making certain that promise was kept. She died 11 days later quietly in her own bed. In the palace she had spent 2 decades filling with more warmth than any stone building has any right to hold, with King Alaric and Prince Rowan at her side. I was not in the room. It was not my place to be, and I have never once resented that, because some moments belong only to family, and I had already been given, in that final private conversation weeks before, everything of her that I had any right to keep for myself. I learned of her passing the way most of the household did, in the gray hour before dawn, when the bell in the cathedral tower, the great bell, reserved only for matters of the gravest consequence to the crown, began to toll, slow and deliberate, and every guardsman on duty that night, myself included, understood exactly what it meant before a single official word had been spoken. I stood my post that night without moving, without being relieved, for 6 additional hours past the end of my shift, because no one came to relieve me, and because I would not have left even if they had. I stood in the gray dark outside the private apartments where she had died, at rigid attention, the same discipline she had first tested with a snowball 20 years before now serving its final and truest purpose. A silent, solitary vigil for a woman who had never once, in all the years I served her, asked me to stand guard over anything except the people she loved. By the time the sun came up over Harrowgate that morning, the whole kingdom knew. And within a week, the world was going to know it too, because the funeral of Queen Isolde of Eldermoor was about to become the largest single gathering of grief that the kingdom had witnessed in living memory. The week between her death and her funeral is, in my memory, a strange blur of formal preparation laid over raw private grief, the two running side by side without ever quite touching. I was assigned, at my own quiet request, to the detail responsible for the funeral procession itself, and I spent that week rehearsing a route through the streets of Harrowgate that I had walked 100 times before on ordinary duty, and would now walk once more for the hardest reason of my career. The flowers began arriving at the palace gates within hours of the official announcement, and they did not stop for the entire week. By the third day, the mounds of them stretched the full length of the outer wall, so deep in places that the household staff could no longer clear a path through them fast enough, and people simply began leaving them further and further down the avenue, until the flowers stretched nearly to the old market square, a full mile of a kingdom's grief laid out in wilting color on the cold stone. I saw, among those flowers, letters and drawings from children who had never met her, thanking her for a sanatorium she had built before they were born, and I understood, standing guard over that improbable river of tribute, that her legacy had already outgrown anything a single funeral could contain. I recognized faces in the crowd that gathered along the funeral route that I do not believe any official record of that day thought to note. Prue, married now with 2 children of her own clinging to her skirts, stood near the front of the crowd outside the old market square with a wreath of bread dough shaped into flowers, baked because she said she had nothing finer to offer and could not bear to offer nothing at all. Corporal Miles, well into his 70s by then and walking with 2 canes rather than 1, had insisted on standing the entire route in his old dress uniform, refusing every offer of a chair, and saluted the passing carriage with a steadiness that put younger men to shame. A long, unbroken line of former patients from the sanatorium stood together near the cathedral steps, many of them survivors of the very fever ward she had first walked into with her bare hands 20 years before, holding a banner between them that read simply, in plain hand-lettered script, "She was not afraid of us." Children from the orphanage she had funded stood in neat rows near the cathedral doors, each one holding a single white flower, and I watched their house matron, a woman Queen Isolde had personally hired and visited without fail for 2 decades, weep without any attempt to compose herself, because there was, on that particular morning, no shame left in the whole of Harrowgate for anyone's grief. I mention all of this because I want you to understand that the 800,000 people who lined that route were not, for the most part, mourning a stranger they had only ever seen in newspapers. A great many of them were mourning someone who had sat on the edge of their bed, or learned their child's name, or pressed a coin into their hand at exactly the moment they needed it most. That is the particular, singular thing a funeral of that size rarely achieves, and hers achieved it without effort, because she had spent 20 years making sure it would. The morning of the funeral was clear and cold, the kind of bright autumn morning that seems almost cruel in its beauty when set against the occasion it is meant to accompany. I was posted, along with the rest of the honor detail, at the base of the cathedral steps, precisely where I had stood at the very beginning of this account, watching the gun carriage come around the last corner at a walk while 800,000 people, lining every inch of the route from the palace to the cathedral, stopped breathing at the same moment. I told you already what that silence felt like, rolling down the avenue like a tide going out. What I did not yet tell you was what came after it. The carriage was drawn by 6 black horses, their coats brushed to a deep polished shine, and the coffin itself was draped in the deep blue and silver of the royal house of Harrowgate, a single wreath of white flowers resting at its center, chosen, I later learned, by Prince Rowan himself from among the varieties his mother had always kept in her private garden. Behind the carriage walked King Alaric, his composure holding by what visibly cost him every ounce of royal training he had ever received, and beside him walked Prince Rowan, 19 years old now, dressed in the formal blacks of state mourning, his spine straight, his jaw set in an expression I recognized instantly, because I had watched his mother wear that exact expression 100 times over the years. The particular stillness of someone determined not to let their grief become a spectacle for others to manage, choosing instead to carry it themselves, in dignified silence, for the sake of everyone watching. I was posted at the cathedral steps, one of a long, unbroken line of guardsmen standing at rigid attention as the coffin approached, and it was my specific honor, though I had not sought it and would not have presumed to ask for it, to be among the small bearer party assigned to help carry her the final distance from the carriage to the cathedral doors. I do not know to this day whether that assignment came from the funeral office through ordinary protocol, or whether Prince Rowan himself had quietly arranged it, though I have my suspicions, given what he said to me afterward. I stepped forward when the carriage stopped, took my position at the coffin's edge alongside 5 other guardsmen, and in the single moment before we lifted, I did something that was not in any protocol, was not rehearsed, and would have earned a junior guardsman a severe reprimand under any ordinary circumstance. I drew off my right glove, the white ceremonial glove I had worn on every formal duty of my career, and I rested my bare hand flat against the cold wood of the coffin for the space of 1 breath before taking up my position properly. No one stopped me. No one reprimanded me, not that day and not afterward. I do not know if anyone beyond the bearer party even saw it happen, in the vastness of that crowd and that grief. But I did it because I had watched her, 20 years before, strip off her own glove in a fever ward that the rest of the kingdom was too frightened to enter, because a glove was a wall and she had spent her entire life refusing to let walls stand between herself and the people she meant to reach. It seemed to me, in that moment, the only fitting way I knew to say goodbye to her, bare hand against the wood, no wall between us, one final time. We carried her up the cathedral steps and into the vast cold hush of the nave, where the highest officers of the kingdom and the humblest citizens who had won a place in the lottery for public seating sat together, united for one mourning in a grief that made no distinction of rank. The service itself was simple, at Queen Isolde's own explicit instruction, left in writing years before in a letter the household office read aloud that morning for the first time. She had asked for no lengthy eulogies from statesmen, no elaborate display, only that the sanatorium's choir, made up largely of recovered patients and the children of the district she had loved, be permitted to sing, and that whatever money would otherwise have been spent on funeral ornamentation be directed instead to the orphanage outside the city. When the sanatorium choir rose to sing, midway through the service, I recognized the melody within the first several notes, and it very nearly undid the composure I had spent the whole morning guarding so carefully. It was the same wordless tune Queen Isolde had been humming under her breath on the morning I first saw her, walking alone through the garden in her plain gray coat, the tune she had hummed to her infant son on 100 mornings along the long water, the tune I had heard drifting from her sitting room window on quiet afternoons for 20 years, without ever once asking its name. I do not know whether the choir master had learned it from her directly during her many visits, or whether he had simply absorbed it the way the rest of us had, by sheer proximity to a woman who could not walk through a room without leaving some small piece of herself behind in it. Whatever the reason, hearing it sung by voices trained in the very ward where she had first taken off her gloves felt, in that moment, less like a hymn and more like the whole of the sanatorium answering her back, one final time, in the only language she had ever truly spoken to them. I stood at the rear of the nave during the service, at rigid attention, and I watched Prince Rowan rise, unbidden, unscheduled, and walk to the front to speak, though nothing in the order of service had called for it. He was not yet a practiced public speaker, not the composed king he would one day become, and his voice shook audibly through the first several sentences. "My mother taught me that a crown means nothing," he said, "unless you use it to make someone else's life a little easier, and that the people who matter most from that kindness will very often never know your name. I have spent my whole life watching her live by that idea. I intend to spend the rest of mine trying to be worthy of having been raised by her." He paused, and I watched him find, somewhere in himself, the same steadiness his mother had shown 1,000 times before him. "She is not remembered today because she was our queen. She is remembered because she never once let being our queen stop her from simply being kind." There was no applause in the cathedral. It would not have been the place for it. But I watched grown men in the pews around me, hardened courtiers and household staff and strangers alike, weep openly and without embarrassment at those words, and I understood that the boy I had watched give away coins to a chestnut seller in the hollow had, in the space of a single terrible week, become something closer to the man his mother had spent his whole childhood quietly building him to be. The committal itself, in the private royal burial ground beyond the cathedral, was reserved for family and the closest members of the household, and I was honored, again at what I believe was Prince Rowan's own quiet request, to stand among the small circle present at the graveside. King Alaric spoke no further words there. He simply stood, holding his son's shoulder, and watched in silence as his wife of 2 decades was laid to rest beneath the same autumn sky that had watched over every one of the small, extraordinary kindnesses I have tried to describe to you across this account. I did not weep at the graveside. I had trained too many years for that particular stillness to abandon me at the moment it was needed most, and some part of me still believed, in that raw first hour, that holding my composure was the last service I could offer her. It was only that night, alone in my own small house, my wife's hand resting on my shoulder and my daughter Wren, grown now into a young woman, asking quietly whether I was well, that the discipline I had spent 20 years perfecting finally, entirely, and without shame, gave way. In the weeks that followed, I returned to duty at the palace and found King Alaric a changed man, quieter than I had ever known him, spending long hours alone in the garden his wife had once walked every morning, though I never once saw him neglect a single duty the crown required of him. He sought me out himself, perhaps a month after the funeral. On one of the rare mornings I found him walking the long water alone, and he thanked me, plainly and without any of the formal distance a king might have been forgiven for maintaining, for the 20 years I had given his wife, and for the small, unauthorized kindness of the bare hand I had rested against her coffin, which he told me he had, in fact, seen after all, from where he walked just behind the bearer party, and had been grateful for ever since. It was, I believe, the only time in my entire career that a monarch of Eldermoor thanked a guardsman for breaking protocol rather than reprimanding him for it, and I have carried that exchange with me, carefully, for every year that has followed. I am an old man now, as I said at the beginning of this account, and it has been a great many years since that autumn morning at the cathedral steps. I retired from active guard duty some time ago, though the household has kept me on in an advisory capacity that I suspect is more sentiment than necessity, and I still make my way to the palace at Harrowgate several times a year, more slowly now than I would like, to walk the grounds and remember. There is a garden there now, near the eastern wing, planted at Prince Rowan's own instruction not long after he came into his full royal duties, filled entirely with the same varieties of white flowers his mother once kept in her private beds, and at its center stands a modest stone bench rather than any grand monument, because Rowan understood, better than any official memorial committee could have, that his mother would have wanted people to sit and rest there, not simply stand and admire a statue. I was there this past spring, sitting on that bench in the late afternoon sun, when Crown Prince Rowan himself found me, a grown man now, married, with children of his own scrambling somewhere on the lawns behind him under the watch of a new generation of guardsmen who stand exactly as I once stood, unmoving, devoted, and entirely unaware of how much devotion it is possible to give to a single family over the course of a life. He sat beside me on the bench without ceremony, the way his mother would have, and for a long while neither of us said anything at all, watching the light move through the white flowers. "I still hear her sometimes," he said eventually, "when I catch myself about to walk past someone without seeing them. It stops me every time. I don't think it will ever stop working." "It never stopped working on me either," I told him. 20 years I served her, and I have spent every year since trying to live as though she is still watching to see whether I remembered what she taught me. He asked me then the same thing young guardsmen sometimes ask me when they learn who I once served, what she was truly like, beneath the crown and the newspapers and the enormous shadow of grief that her death had cast over the whole kingdom that autumn. I told him some of what I have told you here: the snowball, the midnight snow, the fever ward, the small lie that saved a frightened kitchen maid's position. He laughed genuinely at the story of Lord Fen and the emergency drills, a laugh that sounded, for just a moment, exactly like hers. "She would be glad to know you're still telling it," he said. "She always said the people who mattered most would never know her name. I think she was wrong about that one thing in the end. The whole kingdom knew her name. But I think what she meant is still true. She never did any of it to be known. She did it because she couldn't walk past someone in need and pretend she hadn't seen them. That was the whole of her, really." Before he rose to go, Crown Prince Rowan asked me one more question, one he had never quite asked so directly in all the years since his mother's death. He wanted to know whether I believed she would be satisfied if she could see the kingdom now, with what had been built from everything she started. I told him what I believed to be true. The sanatorium she had opened with her bare hands still stood, larger now, treating illnesses far beyond the fever that had first brought her there, and no physician within its walls had worn a glove to greet a frightened patient in 20 years. The orphanage still operated on the endowment she had quietly arranged in her final months, and its children still received, every year without fail, a visit from the crown on their birthdays, a tradition Rowan himself had never once allowed to lapse. The Jubilee Festival in the Hollow still filled that square every year with music and food, and the particular, specific joy of people who had been remembered rather than merely governed. Corporal Miles's citation still hung, freshly reframed at Rowan's own instruction, in the entrance hall of the guards' barracks, where every new recruit walked past it during their first week of training and asked, invariably, who the old soldier in the photograph had been. And every guardsman who served the royal household now, myself included in my advisory years, still sat at a single long table on the night before the winter feast, nobility and scullery maids together, because a queen had once refused, on principle, to dine alone. She built a kingdom that keeps remembering people even when she isn't here to remind it, I told him. I don't know a finer legacy than that, and I don't believe she would have wanted one. He nodded slowly, looking out at the white flowers his mother had once kept in these same beds, and for a moment I saw, quite clearly, both the boy who had once given away his coins to a chestnut seller in the Hollow and the king he would one day become, standing in the same body, carrying the same lesson forward. We sat together a while longer, an old guardsman and the son of the woman he had spent the finest years of his life protecting, until the light began to fade, and his children's voices called him back across the lawn. He clasped my hand before he left, bare palm against bare palm, no glove between us, and I do not believe that was an accident, because I had told him, some years before, exactly why I had once done the same thing on the steps of a cathedral. I still visit that bench when I am able. I bring nothing with me, and I ask nothing of it. I simply sit, the way she taught an entire kingdom to sit beside people who needed company. And I remember a queen who threw a snowball at a terrified young guardsman on a cold morning, because she wanted to know if there was a person worth keeping underneath the uniform, and who spent every year after that proving, over and over, in 100 small and enormous ways, that there had been a person worth keeping underneath her own crown all along. She asked me once to look after her son, not as his guard, but as a man who remembered what she had tried to build in him. I have done that, as faithfully as I know how, for all the years since, and I will go on doing it for whatever years I have left. It is, I have come to understand, the truest kind of guard duty there is, not standing motionless at a gate, but carrying forward, quietly and for as long as a life allows, the memory of someone whose kindness never once asked to be remembered, and who is remembered anyway by every person whose hand she ever held.